There's a city sitting at the bottom of the ocean off the coast of India that mainstream archaeology does not want to talk about. Not because it does not exist. The sonar images are real. The artifacts are real. The carbon dating is real. They do not want to talk about it because if it is what the evidence suggests, then the entire timeline of human civilization that every school textbook on Earth currently teaches is wrong. Not slightly off, not in need of minor adjustment. Wrong by thousands of years. This city, buried under 36 meters of seawater in the Gulf of Khambhat in northwestern India, appears to have been built 9,500 years ago. That date would make it the oldest urban settlement ever found by an enormous margin. Older than the pyramids of Egypt. Older than Sumerian Mesopotamia. Older than every civilization that the mainstream history of humanity currently acknowledges. And in 2025, Grok AI was given the complete body of evidence, every sonar scan, every carbon date, every artifact description, every piece of geological sea level data, everything that has been gathered and disputed and ignored over 25 years, and asked to evaluate it all together without the career pressures and institutional politics that have shaped how human researchers have handled this discovery. What it found is considerably harder to dismiss than anyone expected. And the reason the city has been buried twice, once by the ocean and once by academic silence, is a story that tells you as much about how knowledge works as it does about ancient India. The place is called the Gulf of Khambhat. You may also see it spelled Khambhat, which is the older name for the same body of water. It sits on the northwest coast of India, in the state of Gujarat, a shallow tidal gulf that experiences enormous tidal flows, carrying massive amounts of sediment in and out with each tide cycle. It is the kind of place that ocean technology researchers routinely survey for pollution, because the strong currents and sediment movement create environmental concerns. And it was during exactly one of those routine pollution surveys in December of the year 2000 that a team from India's National Institute of Ocean Technology, the NIOT, pointed their sonar equipment at the seafloor and found something that stopped them cold. What the sonar showed was geometric, symmetrical, regular, the kind of patterns that water and sediment simply do not produce on their own. Straight lines, rectangular outlines, grid-like arrangements extending across the seafloor for an area roughly 8 kilometers long and 3 kilometers wide. The sonar images showed what appeared to be streets, building outlines, and large rectangular structures arranged in the systematic way that only planned settlements produce. The team ran the survey again. The patterns held. They were not instrument noise. They were not misread data. Something was down there, 30 to 40 meters below the surface, covering an area larger than the city of Manhattan. The dredging brought up pottery fragments, stone tools, a human jaw fragment, and most critically, a piece of wood. The wood was sent to the National Geophysical Research Institute in India for carbon dating. Carbon dating works by measuring the ratio of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope that living organisms absorb from the atmosphere while alive, to the total carbon in a sample. After an organism dies, the carbon-14 begins to decay at a known, precisely measured rate. By measuring how much is left, you can calculate when the organism died, when the tree that produced that piece of wood was alive. The result that came back from the NIOT wood sample was not ambiguous. The wood dated to between 7,500 and 9,500 years old. A human jaw fragment recovered from the same area was independently dated to approximately 9,500 years ago. The BBC ran a story in 2002 calling this the lost city that could rewrite history. And then, with remarkable speed, the mainstream archaeological community went quiet. Here is why the date is so catastrophically disruptive to conventional history. The Indus Valley Civilization, which is the oldest known complex society on the Indian subcontinent, developed around 2,600 years before the Common Era, roughly 4,600 years ago. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, with their sophisticated urban planning, their standardized weights and measures, their drainage systems, their still undeciphered writing, those cities represent what mainstream history considers the earliest urban civilization in South Asia. They are remarkable. They are also, by the standard timeline, relatively recent. Egypt's Old Kingdom, the civilization that built the pyramids, was their approximate contemporary. The broader pattern of complex civilization emerging in multiple regions around the 3rd millennium BCE, the period from about 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, is the framework within which Indian prehistory has been understood by every archaeologist teaching in every university. A city at 9,500 years old does not fit into that framework. It does not slightly stress the framework, it destroys it. Because 9,500 years ago, the standard history of the Indian subcontinent says there were no cities. The oldest confirmed agricultural communities in South Asia date to approximately 7,000 to 6,000 years before the Common Era. The oldest confirmed settled villages are slightly later than that. Cities with the planning, the the construction, the large-scale organization that the Khambhat sonar images suggest were not supposed to appear until thousands of years after the proposed date of this site. Either the mainstream framework is broadly correct and the Khambhat evidence is flawed, or the mainstream framework is missing an entire chapter of human history that was swallowed by the ocean at the end of the last ice age. The sonar analysis was the starting point. Side-scan sonar works by emitting sound waves in a fan pattern beneath a vessel and recording the echoes that return from the seafloor. Different materials and surface textures produce different echo intensities and patterns, allowing researchers to build acoustic images of what lies beneath the water. Flat uniform sediment produces one signature. Natural geological formations, river channels, tectonic fractures, sediment ripples produce characteristic signatures that experienced sonar analysts can recognize. Geometric man-made structures produce a different set of signatures, and those signatures have been well documented at dozens of confirmed underwater archaeological sites around the world. Grok's analysis compared the specific acoustic patterns from the Khambhat sonar data against two reference databases. First, documented sonar signatures from natural geological formations found in similar marine environments. Second, documented sonar signatures from confirmed submerged archaeological sites that have been verified through direct physical investigation. The confirmed underwater site database includes places like Thonis Heracleon, the ancient Egyptian port city discovered in the year 2000, 7 kilometers off the Egyptian coast in the Nile Delta, where excavations since 2023 have uncovered temples and sanctuaries under the Mediterranean. It includes dozens of sites off the coasts of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, where rising seas after the Ice Age swallowed settlements that humans had built on what was then dry land. The comparison produced a specific statistical finding. The Khambhat sonar patterns show characteristics that are more similar to the confirmed archaeological site database than to the natural geological formation database. The specific combination of pattern regularity, the internal consistency of scale across the surveyed area, and the edge definition of the geometric outlines fall within the range seen at sites confirmed to be human-made, and outside the range typical of natural geological formations in comparable marine environments. This does not prove the patterns represent a city. Sonar interpretation involves real uncertainty, and the databases contain variation, but it establishes something specific and important. The dismissal of the Khambhat sonar data as obviously natural geological formations, the position that has been the mainstream default for 25 years, is not supported by systematic comparative analysis. The patterns are more consistent with archaeological structures than with the natural geological features most commonly proposed as alternative explanations. Then there is the carbon dating, and this is where the debate becomes sharpest. The mainstream skeptical position on the carbon-dated wood is that the wood may not be from construction. It could be naturally occurring wood from ancient forests that existed in the region before the sea level rose, trees that fell and were buried and have nothing to do with any human settlement. On this reading, the ancient wood and the geometric sonar patterns are coincidental, both real but unconnected. Grok's analysis addressed this by cross-referencing the depth at which the wood was recovered against the detailed sea level history of the Gulf of Khambhat region. Sea level reconstruction for this area is not speculative. Global ice core data, sediment core analysis from ocean floors worldwide, and direct geological surveys of coastal regions have produced well-established records of how sea levels changed as the last ice age ended and the planet warmed. At the time the wood was living, between 7,500 and 9,500 years ago, sea levels in the Gulf of Khambhat were significantly lower than today. At the beginning of that period, the area where the Khambhat structures are located was either dry land or very shallow coastal water. The depth at which the wood sample was recovered, within the same zone where the sonar patterns appear, is consistent with wood deposited in a dry land context during the period of the carbon date, subsequently covered as sea levels rose and sediment accumulated over millennia. The alternative explanation, the natural ancient forest wood theory, requires ancient trees growing in the area to have deposited their wood at the exact depth and location where the sonar patterns appear, at the exact time period when the area was above sea level and capable of supporting forest growth. That coincidence is possible, but it is not as plausible as the straightforward interpretation. The wood is from structures that were built when the land was dry. The sea level history is the geological context that makes all of this coherent, and it is the context that the academic debate has systematically underemphasized. Here is what the Earth was doing at the end of the last ice age, and what it means for the Indian subcontinent specifically. The last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, occurred approximately 20,000 years ago. At that time, vast quantities of water that are now in the oceans were locked up in enormous ice sheets covering large parts of North America, Europe, and Asia. Sea levels globally were approximately 100 to 120 meters lower than they are today. As the planet warmed, those ice sheets melted over thousands of years and the water returned to the oceans, raising sea levels gradually around the world. This is not a theory. It is one of the best documented processes in geological science, confirmed by ice core data, ocean sediment cores, fossilized coral reefs, and countless other independent lines of evidence. Grok's reconstruction of the site history produces a specific timeline that is consistent with all of the available evidence simultaneously. The site was above sea level until approximately 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. The river running through the area provided fresh water to communities on its banks. The community grew large enough to produce the urban-scale organization the sonar patterns suggest. As global sea levels rose over subsequent centuries, the area was gradually inundated. The flooding was not sudden and catastrophic. It happened over generations as the coastline slowly advanced inland. The communities living there would have experienced encroaching water, retreating step by step, eventually abandoning settlements that the sea was consuming. The submergence to current depth, 36 meters, was complete approximately 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. The structures, built on the coastal plain near the river mouth, were sealed under water and sediment and remained there undisturbed for 7,000 years until a pollution survey accidentally pointed sonar at the seafloor and found them. Now consider what this does to something much older than archaeology. The Vedas are the oldest religious texts of the Indian tradition, and they are among the oldest continuous literary traditions in human existence. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the 4 Vedic texts, is composed in a form of Sanskrit that linguists estimate dates to approximately 1500 BCE in its current form, but which contains passages that linguistic analysis suggests are considerably older, preserved orally through generations before they were ever written down. And the Rig Veda contains descriptions of a civilization that the text treats as ancestral, a civilization that existed before the one producing the hymns. Crucially, it describes a great river called the Saraswati, a river flowing from the mountains to the sea, supporting dense populations of cities and settlements along its banks. This river is described as mightier than any other, as the central artery of the most advanced civilization the authors knew of. The Saraswati is not currently a river. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system in northwestern India and Pakistan, now mostly dry or seasonal, has been identified through satellite imagery and geological surveys as the likely ancient Saraswati. The satellite data and ground surveys confirm that the Ghaggar-Hakra system was a substantial permanent river in the period between approximately 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, the same period covered by the Khambhat carbon dates. Grok's analysis identified a specific geographical relationship. The ancient Saraswati Ghaggar-Hakra river system, flowing from the Himalayan foothills toward the northwest coast of the Indian subcontinent, would have reached the sea in the general region of the Gulf of Khambhat. A civilization distributed along that river, as the Vedic texts describe, would naturally have its most significant coastal settlement at the river's mouth. In the Gulf of Khambhat, at the depth of 36 meters, where the sonar patterns and the carbon-dated wood and the 9,500-year-old human jaw fragment were found. The Vedic texts may be preserving something that oral traditions have been documented to preserve across many cultures: a memory, a cultural inheritance of a civilization that existed before the civilization that composed the texts themselves. Flood memory and the memory of drowned landscapes have been found in oral traditions from Australian Aboriginal cultures, which preserve accounts of specific coastline geography that was last accessible more than 10,000 years ago, to the Pacific Island cultures whose traditions describe islands now underwater, to the coastal peoples of North America whose stories reference landscapes that match the geography of the continental shelf during the Ice Age. The oldest continuous oral tradition in human history, the Vedic tradition of the Indian subcontinent, contains detailed descriptions of a civilization centered on a great river that no longer flows, with cities that are no longer visible in an area that is now underwater. The Khambhat discovery is the first physical candidate for what those descriptions might be describing. What is the honest state of this site now in 2025, 25 years after the initial discovery? The answer is uncomfortable. The site has not been properly excavated. The Indian government's National Institute of Ocean Technology conducted the initial survey. Follow-up investigations have been sporadic, underfunded, and have not produced the controlled archaeological excavation that would provide the definitive answers the evidence demands. The mainstream archaeological community's response has been expressed primarily through silence rather than systematic refutation. The sonar data has not been comprehensively reanalyzed with the modern techniques that have been applied to other disputed underwater sites. The full artifact assemblage has not been published in peer-reviewed archaeological literature. The site, which if confirmed would be the most significant archaeological discovery in human history, has received less investigation than a routine Neolithic village find in rural England. This is the finding that Grok's analysis landed on most heavily, not a verdict on whether Khambhat is a 9,500-year-old city. It cannot reach that verdict. The data does not yet support that verdict. But it established that the case for dismissing Khambhat as geological formation plus contaminated carbon dating is not as strong as 25 years of institutional silence has implied. The sonar patterns are more consistent with archaeological structures than with documented natural formations. The carbon dating is consistent with the independently established sea level history. The artifacts are consistent with the proposed chronology. The geographical context, the ancient river, the coastal position, the depth consistent with post-glacial submergence fits the physical evidence. And the Vedic texts, which have been dismissed as mythology for the purpose of this discussion, despite being the oldest surviving literature of an entire civilization, describe exactly the kind of rivermouth urban settlement in exactly this region from exactly this time period. None of this is proof. Proof requires controlled, methodical, properly funded underwater excavation of the kind that confirmed underwater sites routinely receive. Excavation that places every recovered object in its precise sediment layer, documents its exact position within the site, preserves the stratigraphic context that allows artifacts to be definitively dated and associated with specific structures. The Khambhat site has never received that excavation. And the reason it has not is not technical. The tools exist. Underwater archaeology is a well-developed discipline with established methods for controlled excavation of submerged sites. It has been applied to far less significant sites around the world, including the ongoing excavation of Thonis Heraklion off Egypt's coast, where discoveries of temples and sanctuaries continued as recently as 2023. It has simply not been applied to Khambhat. The most potentially significant underwater site on Earth has been excavated by dredging once in the early 2000s, and then left to sit under the sediment of the Gulf of Khambhat, while the academic community that should be demanding answers has maintained a careful, career-protecting quiet. 36 meters of water, 7,000 to 9,000 years of sediment, an 8-kilometer-long site that has been known about for 25 years, and has been sitting at the bottom of a tidal gulf receiving essentially no systematic investigation, while the question of whether it represents the oldest city ever built quietly goes unanswered. The sonar patterns are still there. The artifacts are still there. The sea level geology is still there. The ancient river channel is still there. And the oldest literary tradition on Earth is still describing a great civilization on a great river in exactly this region. At some point, the question stops being about the site and starts being about what it says about science and institutions and career incentives that the most potentially important archaeological discovery in human history has been sitting at the bottom of the Gulf of Khambhat for 25 years and counting, waiting for someone to look at it seriously. Grok AI looked at it, and what it found is that the silence was not justified. The evidence is not dismissible. The excavation needs to happen. And until it does, the city beneath the Gulf of Khambhat is going to keep sitting in the dark at the bottom of the ocean, older than Egypt, older than Mesopotamia, older than everything we call civilization, waiting for someone to go down and find out what it actually is. There is one more dimension to this that almost nobody covering Khambhat has addressed properly, and it changes the scale of what we are talking about considerably. Khambhat is not a unique case. It is the most dramatic example of a global pattern. Scientists working on post-glacial sea level reconstruction have calculated that approximately 27 million square kilometers of land surface that was above water during the peak of the last ice age is now underwater. 27 million square kilometers. For comparison, the entire continent of North America is about 24 million square kilometers. An area larger than North America that was dry land 10,000 to 20,000 years ago is now under the oceans of the world. And throughout that entire period of dry land, human beings existed. Modern human anatomy goes back at least 300,000 years. Behavioral modernity, the full range of human cognitive capacity, goes back at least 70,000 years. The period when that land was above water and available for human settlement covers the entire span of modern human existence. But we know almost nothing about what humans were doing on that land because it is underwater. Every coastal settlement, every river delta city, every island community, every harbor town built by human beings during the Ice Age and the early post-glacial period has been sitting under the ocean since the sea swallowed it. Khambhat may be the most visible and most documented example of what that means, but the pattern of post-glacial submergence extends from the Indian subcontinent to the Persian Gulf, where underwater surveys have found evidence of habitation on what is now the Gulf floor, to the continental shelf of northern Europe, where Stone Age artifacts are routinely recovered by fishing trawlers from the now submerged North Sea plain, to the coastal waters around Australia, where Aboriginal oral traditions describe specific coastal features and islands that are now underwater and have been confirmed by geological surveys to match the coastline as it existed more than 10,000 years ago. The history of human civilization, as it is currently written, is the history of what was above water. It is the history of what survived. The civilizations that built on coastlines, on river deltas, on the shallow continental shelves that were the richest and most habitable land available to early humans, those civilizations disappeared under the sea when the Ice Age ended, and we have been telling the story of human origins without them. Khambhat is the crack in the floor of the ocean through which that missing history is most visible. And what you see when you look through that crack, what Grok AI saw when it analyzed 25 years of accumulated and mostly ignored evidence, is the outline of something much larger and much older than the story we have been told.